Next time in Moscow?
Oh.
In 2025, global geopolitics no longer looks like what you see in textbooks. The balance of power is wavering. Diplomacy is played out as much in trading rooms as on the front lines. And the old rules of the game seem more outdated every day. Behind the staggering numbers of American debt, massive economic sanctions, and energy negotiations, entire continents are searching for their place in a world that has become truly multipolar. Ukraine, which appears to be a localized theater of war, is emerging as the pivotal accelerator of a global reshaping, where Washington is trying to preserve its supremacy. In this new world, Moscow is playing a war of attrition. Beijing and New Delhi are asserting their independence, and Europe hesitates between autonomy and loyalty to Uncle Sam. The planned meeting between Putin and Trump in Alaska was far from a simple diplomatic summit. It crystallized the turning point of this new era. Here, new power dynamics, new achievements, rules, and new uncertainties are emerging. Welcome to Terra Bellum. Good news in Alaska for the United States and Russia. The Alaska summit between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin will no doubt go down in history as a demonstration of this new Realpolitik, but above all as a revelation of the complexity, even cynicism, that now dominates global diplomacy. The event did not result in a ceasefire or an immediate peace agreement, but for the first time in years, it laid the groundwork for direct bilateral dialogue between Washington and Moscow. The exchanges, widely described as friendly and constructive, highlighted the shared desire to restore certain economic ties. The plan to reopen direct air links between Russia and the United States, mentioned by the Russian ambassador in Washington, is symbolic of a cautious detente, but also of shared commercial interests beyond public posturing. While immediate peace is not yet on the agenda, the announcement of restored communication between the two capitals signals a change in tone. In this process, Ukraine appears not as a sovereign actor, but as a strategic ground where American and Russian interests clash. Ukrainian diplomacy is confined to a secondary role. Volodymyr Zelensky was even summoned to the White House in the following days, asked to adopt a constructive stance without truly being able to control the conditions of the imposed framework. The tension of the post-summit phone conversation between Trump, Zelensky, and the European leaders, described as difficult by several observers, is the most direct illustration of this. The United States, to remain dominant, is joining the multipolar game and playing by its rules. Europe, while reiterating unwavering support for Ukraine, finds itself placed on the sidelines of decisive decision-making, neither a driving force nor an arbiter of the issue, relegated to a supporting role. The European Union struggles to exist as an independent strategic power. The handling of the Ukrainian issue, therefore, still centers on Washington and Moscow. The Europeans, as has been said for months, will have to deal with the consequences more than the decisions. Trump quickly shifted the responsibility for Ukraine's fate to Zelensky, calling on him to take the initiative to negotiate with Moscow, while urging the Europeans to do more for peace. He also opposed any new round of sanctions for the time being, preferring to capitalize on a dynamic of diplomatic appeasement with Putin, who is now openly described as a strong and intelligent leader by the American president. Notably, Trump is targeting not just a simple ceasefire, but a comprehensive and lasting peace agreement, remarks echoed by Marco Rubio, and directly reflecting the Kremlin's long-term demands. In the background, the summit confirms a geopolitical reality that has been known for decades, but has been deliberately or unintentionally forgotten. Ukraine remains above all a strategic lever, instrumentalized by the two superpowers, while European diplomacy proves powerless to shape an independent policy. And that local room for maneuver is shrinking in the face of an increasingly dangerous military dynamic for Ukraine. In this new context, what happens next will largely depend on the ability or inability of local actors to influence the negotiations, on the Europeans' appetite to move beyond their support role, and finally, on Ukraine's willingness to negotiate within a framework that is imposed on it, if not already prepared. And the Alaska summit therefore perfectly embodies the logic of contemporary realpolitik, and the emerging multipolar world in which the United States now takes part. First of all, a bilateral dialogue without real multilateral mediation, where the fate of a state depends on the clash or alignment of the interests of greater powers. At last, an exchange highlighting Ukraine's strategic location, Russian economic support from Asia, resources, power moves by India and China, and military balance. We've discussed all this on our channel. Weighs more than any speech about rights and sovereignty. And finally, Europe, which, despite its show of unity, remains for now a second-tier player on the international stage, lacking an understanding of the emerging world, the will, the capacity, and sufficient diplomatic autonomy to become a true counterweight or mediator. Such is the good news from Alaska, a temporary relief for Washington and Moscow, who shake hands at the dawn of a multipolar order, a warning for Europeans. And above all, the confirmation that global geopolitics definitely does not offer a free seat at the table of great powers, and that this needs to be understood. All this is happening in a particular context. American hegemony is showing its limits. The thalassocracy now has to face the rise of the Eurasian continent, whether through major powers like China and India, or through the emergence of regional players like Turkey and Vietnam. Areas of economic, military, and technological conflict are multiplying, and in the long term, this could be devastating for the United States, whose global power relies on international trade, control of the seas, and military projection. In 2025, the U.S. public debt reaches an unprecedented level, peaking at over $37 trillion, which is 122% of GDP. This burden is growing faster than the economy, threatening medium-term sustainability. The annual interest payments alone, about $1.2 trillion, now exceed military spending. Some months, 65% of income tax is used solely to pay this interest. This illustrates a crucial point. A military superpower engaged across all the oceans now depends on its ability to refinance its debt in order to project its power. So behind the accounting lies a major geopolitical issue, and Trump has understood this well. This dependence is worsened by the fact that about 30% of the debt is held by foreign investors. In other words, Washington's power is based on continuous credit extended by the global financial system. And this exorbitant privilege of the dollar as the world's reserve currency is a strategic asset, but also a vulnerability if trust were to falter. Domestically, America is divided between a protectionist movement that seeks to bring value chains back home and a globalized liberal movement that defends open trade. This duality results in a sometimes incoherent foreign policy, which can undermine its ability to adapt strategically in a multipolar world where decisions are made more and more quickly, and often outside multilateral channels. Finally, America's dependence on critical supply chains, especially in China for rare earth elements, is not just economic, it is geopolitical. These resources, essential for advanced military and industrial technologies, pass through maritime corridors that are exposed. As we've seen, the Strait of Malacca, the South China Sea, even the Suez Canal, all require constant naval and diplomatic control. Here, geography directly determines economic security. So we come back to the July 2025 trilateral agreement between Washington, Brussels, and Tokyo, which shows how American diplomacy is intertwined with the economy. As you know, the European Union is committed to investing $600 billion in the United States and to purchasing about $750 billion worth of energy from the United States, while also accepting quotas on steel and aluminum, officially justified by the need to reduce dependence on Russia. In reality, this agreement anchors Europe in an American supply system that reduces its strategic flexibility. And a few days earlier, Japan had accepted a similar American 15% hike on its automobile and electronics exports, which represents about 17% of its total sales, in exchange for continued access to the American market. These concessions are not just economic, they are dictated by the reality of their respective geographic positions. Europe, dependent on external energy supplies, and Japan, isolated by the sea and vulnerable to regional tensions, see in this agreement a form of strategic insurance by aligning themselves with the United States. Of course, this serves Washington's interests because Washington's going even further by eventually developing a true economic high point with regulatory control over key sectors such as 5G AI and semiconductors, which acts as a technological barrier. By imposing these standards, the United States locks down global value chains and limits the rise of future competitors on the continent, while binding their allies into regulatory frameworks that will be difficult for them to escape.
Just a few weeks ago, we made the biggest trade deal in history. It's a big thing. Congrats, that's great. Thanks a lot.
The redirection of European energy flows to American hydrocarbons is not just a simple change of supplier. It is reshaping the global energy map, certainly reducing Russian influence in Europe, but giving Washington leverage over political decisions. That's what we're seeing right now. The geography of resources and supply routes is becoming a central element of American power here. In this emerging new order, Ukraine is not just a battlefield, it is a strategic node at the crossroads of Europe and Russia, a periphery of the Russian and American empires, connecting energy, agricultural, and industrial flows through its lands and ports. That is why the American secondary sanctions have sought to cut off all economic channels that allow Russia to finance its war effort. However, this strategy has faced resistance from the BRICS. India, which imports 35% of its crude oil from Russia, continues its purchases despite additional tariff threats.
Supérieur à 25%.
China, another key player, even increased its customs duties several months ago, up to 125% on certain American products. This is part of the economic war. At the same time, it is pursuing its geopolitical ambitions through the new Silk Roads and by promoting the international use of the yuan. Together, Beijing and New Delhi have provided Moscow with a diplomatic and commercial safety net that has reduced the effectiveness of sanctions and strengthened Russia's ability to stay in the war. Hence the trade truce that later followed with China and the meeting in Alaska. On the ground, the Donbass is the country's strategic keystone. For Russia, controlling it allows them to threaten the heart of Ukraine. For Kiev, it is a vital line of resistance. The Ukrainian constitution prohibits any cession of territory without a referendum, limiting Zelensky's room for maneuver and making the implementation of any agreement sensitive within Ukraine. This internal divide illustrates how, in a modern conflict, military and political unity weighs just as much as the weapons themselves. But when facing the United States and Russia, will Ukraine really have a choice? Or will it then go it alone with the European Union? In both cases, the net cast by the Russian-American duo is tightly drawn. This then raises the question, if Ukraine refuses the Russian-American proposal, the war will continue. What about resources then? And more specifically, the manpower to sustain this war of attrition. Didn't Henry Kissinger once say, being an enemy of the United States is dangerous, but being its friend is fatal? The Americans are playing a game that the Europeans are not mature enough to understand, fighting to maintain their global hegemony, while the Europeans, lacking long-term strategic vision, struggle to maintain support for their leaders' mandates. In the turmoil of sanctions, alliances, and territorial negotiations, it becomes clear that today's world no longer has room for naivety. Politics and war, economics and geography intertwine to shape a new order, unstable and sometimes brutally cynical. The United States sees its hegemony challenged. Russia adapts and capitalizes on the support of Asian powers, Europe is still searching for its direction, and Ukraine remains hostage to forces beyond its control. On the international stage, every decision shapes the fate of states and entire peoples, but nothing is final. Force dictates negotiation, diplomacy formalizes power relations, and uncertainty becomes the only certainty. If you enjoyed this analysis and want to make sure you don't miss any future videos, consider subscribing to the channel and clicking the bell to receive notifications. Feel free to like, share with others, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Your support is more essential than ever on YouTube in 2025. Thank you to Ollie for sponsoring this video. Check the link in the description or use the QR code to get a discount. Thank you all for your support.